My name's Kali Reid. I am the Business and Development Manager at Campbelltown Arts Centre. I have been working in the arts and entertainment industries for a long time. I spent a lot of time in the independent sector and was one of the co-founders of 107 Projects in Redfern. I think a lot of artists want to stay as far away from the money as they possibly can. They're not interested, don't want to be part of it, hate it, just want to stay away. But I think the really great thing about being able to do your own budgeting, about being actively involved in that process, is it actually gives you a lot more freedom and gives you the capacity to do more, I suppose. You know, if you're good at budgeting, then you can convince someone else to give you more money, which means you can do more complicated projects, more exciting projects, and really move up in that sort of scale sort of side of things. Look, I also think that that budgeting is really important in the artistic process, and that in the process of figuring out how much things cost, it actually helps you to make good artistic decisions. And of course, the other side of that is that if you're good at budgeting, it's going to be absolutely crucial to giving you a more sustainable career and being able to keep on pushing yourself forward. Pricing is tricky, you know. It's like pricing is not easy, and it's not a science. It's an art form, and there's lots of things to consider. I think that there's a tendency sometimes for people to say, "Oh, well, this took me 5 hours, so it's worth equivalent of 5 hours worth of work." But the world's not like that, and it's not how it works. So I think when people are pricing, they really need to consider that needs to go out and have a look and see what are people, my peers, you know, people operating at the same sort of level, you know, what are they charging for their work? They need to think about their audience. Who's going to buy my work? So is that my friends and family? And if it's my friends and family, how much do you think they're going to, you know, what's their price point? You know, what's their point at which they, you know, gets too much for them? I think once you start to kind of then extrapolate that out, you need to be constantly looking at, you know, doing sort of an annual review of your pricing as well, I think is really important. The other thing I think with pricing is that you need to think about being consistent across your whole body of work. So, you know, sometimes I think they'll have one artwork which is like their favourite work, and they're like, I really don't want to part with this, so I'm going to make it really expensive, compared to, say, this other really, you know, that might be tiny work, and this would be a larger canvas, and they're saying, okay, well, you know, I'll make that cheaper or somehow. I think really thinking about consistency across different exhibitions, if you're doing multiple exhibitions, across different platforms, you know, having a sense of structure for yourself so it doesn't just feel like you're plucking numbers out of the air. There's lots and lots of different funding avenues and different funding opportunities available for artists, and I suppose it changes a bit depending on what level your practice is at and where you're at in your career. So, you know, some of the, you know, options are, you know, there's always the self-funding option, where where you're, you know, making money from selling your work, you know, commercially. That's another option. Grant funding is an avenue that people should consider. And grant funding, you know, mostly I suppose from either the state funding bodies or from Australia Council for the Arts, I suppose two key places. But then there's also other opportunities as well. So there's things to keep an eye out with your local council or other, you know, grant programs that you might come across. There's also, you know, you should also think about sponsorship opportunities or corporate partnerships. So you might be being paid to include part of a design of your work or something in someone's advertising campaign, or, you know, there's opportunities there. Crowdfunding, sorry, it's the word I was looking for. So crowdfunding has also become incredibly popular over the last few years, and I think there was a moment there where everyone thought this was going to be, you know, the panacea for all things, and that crowdfunding was for everybody. It's not. It's a great tool if you've got for the right project. So I think, you know, crowdfunding works really well for people who are really good with social media, love spruiking themselves, and, you know, and have a big network of friends and family who they can draw on to support their project. It, you know, doesn't work so well if you don't like any of those things. If you hate social media, stay the hell away from it. But I also think crowdfunding can be really good where you have like a product coming out at the end. So say, I know some friends of mine they were making a book, and they needed money to print the book, and so basically the crowdfunding process was that you were pre-buying a copy of the book, and that then helped them to get the printing costs up, which was really great for them. So philanthropy is another option for funding for artists. It can be sometimes a bit more difficult to get into, or it really depends on I think it depends on you and where you're at. So same with all things money related in the arts and all things career related in the arts. There's no one size fits all. So it really depends on where you're up to. There's opportunity. Philanthropists are often looking for the tax break in return for donating or for supporting you. And you can, for example, look at the Australian Cultural Fund, which is sort of like an auspicing body, I suppose, for philanthropy. So that's another option as well. So research should be part of everyone's practice, and I think that research comes into lots of different parts of how you develop your practice, how you define your practice, and how you progress your practice. I think in terms of pricing, that's a lot about going out and seeing how much other artists are charging when they're exhibiting their work, or if they're charging at all. Some conceptual artists, that's completely irrelevant. I think then when you're looking more broadly at how you are charging for your services, for example, with some of the other activities that you might be doing alongside your artistic practice, so not specifically for your work. I think that, again, there's so much to be said for talking to people, talking to your peers and saying, okay, well, how much is such and such gallery charging for in-store crew compared to what this other gallery that's offering me work, are charging for in-store crew? What are educators being paid at the major institutions, if that's what you're into? I think it really pays to talk to people, and that's where I also think it's really important for artists to consider, finding mentor people who can be a sounding board and who they can bounce those ideas off, and they can be peers as well as people who are more experienced or have a different type of experience. Selling out, this issue, this idea of, what is it to sell out? When do you sell out? It's something that comes up time and time again. And it's certainly something that, as a young person, when I was in my 20s and just starting to get into the arts industry, it was something I was terrified of. I think it's really important for artists to not be afraid of being paid for their work. Full stop. That's, I think for years I felt like I shouldn't ask for money. I shouldn't expect to be paid for work I was doing, and that was whether I was making art or whether I was working on a creative project. And it's ridiculous, and it doesn't get you anywhere. It helps to be malleable when you're doing like experimental projects or you're just testing things out. That's fine, but I think it's really important to not be afraid of being paid for your work, and to value yourself. Your work is valuable. I think. Then you can kind of go on to other scenarios where you can, there's lots of, I think the concept of selling out really feeds into marketing, actually, because there are things that you should, there are silly things to do in terms of how you're pitching yourself, which come back to commercial agreements sometimes. So, so if you're getting yourself into a really unfair deal, say with an advertiser, for example, who wants to, use your work as part of the backdrop of something, and, your name's going to be all over it, doesn't really help your career, then that's not necessarily a great partnership. So in that sense, and, you can see, I think when people say, oh, they're such a sellout, it's because they've seen a bad fit for someone, and a commercially bad fit for someone where their work is maybe not being valued the way that it should be. I know a lot of artists, I know a lot of very successful artists. There are very, very few of them who make their regular weekly income from their work. It's unfortunate, it's just the way it is. They all do other things, and probably the other things they do help keep them sane and help keep them interacting and doing other things in the world as well. I think that's completely fine. And there's lots of really great ways that you can support your creative practice that are not counter to your practice, that aren't selling out, that aren't leaving yourself working in corporate world, or sometimes that's great for people as well. There's lots of different opportunities. You can become an educator, you can be an arts educator, you can work installing exhibitions, you can work for one of the major institutions, gallery attending. You can become an arts worker like I did, you can, and like lots of people do. There's lots of opportunities.